Welcome to our panel discussion, Race and the 2020 Elections, the United States as a Democratic Project. We wish to thank Union Presbyterian Seminary, the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership for sponsoring today's forum. A few notes before we start. Only panelists will be speaking during the session. Use the chat feature to ask questions. This webinar is being recorded, so you can watch it again or share with others. Our panelists tonight are Reverend Dr. Obery Hendricks, visiting scholar in religion and African American and African diaspora studies at Columbia University, and distinguished senior fellow at the Democracy Collaborative think tank. Dr. Stacy Floyd-Thomas, the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Chair and Associate Professor of Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. Dr. Rachel Sophia Baard, Assistant Professor of Theology and Ethics at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Oh, my bad. Associate Professor of Theology and Ethics at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Sam Zeigler, a Master of Divinity student and moderator for Union Diversity at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Our host and moderator is Dr. Rodney Sadler, Jr., Associate Professor of Bible and Director of the Seminary's Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation. Dr. Sadler, the floor is yours.
I want to say thank you so much, my brother Michael, for your wonderful introductions. And it's great to see all of you here with us this evening. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation. Tuesday past was one of the most contentious and consequential elections in American history. It featured polls that were wildly inaccurate, fear-mongering on all sides, a polarization felt within many purple congregations, and an incumbent bent on maintaining office, regardless of the outcome. In every election cycle, the mantra is heard, this is the most important election of our lifetime. This one, however, just actually might have been. For many African American, Indigenous American, Puerto Rican, Latinx, Jewish, Muslim, LGBTQIA people, there was legitimate existential angst about this election. As a plethora of oversized pickup trucks roamed the streets and roads of North Carolina, trailed by oversized Trump and Klan flags, there was a constant fear that gun-toting militias could begin the slaughter of innocents at any moment, fueled by the reckless words of a would-be tyrant. Subsequent to the election, this tyrant has refused to accept the results and has pledged to fight the injustice of his electoral defeat. Certainly, this is not the way that elections are supposed to occur in a nation that prides itself on the peaceful exchange of executive power and nonviolent revolutions that take place at our polls. Tonight, I'm looking forward to a biblical and theologically based conversation that will explore the outcome of the election and its implications for social justice, voter participation, and race relations in our nation. Let's just get started tonight, and I'm going to ask my first question of the Reverend Dr. Stacy Floyd-Thomas. I see that you're wearing white tonight, and I wonder if there's a reason for this.
There's definitely a reason.
I wonder what it could be. This is the first time that a Black woman has been on a presidential ticket. What does Kamala Harris being on this ticket say about the future of Black women's leadership in politics and in the church?
Well, you are definitely right. Thank you so much to you and Union Presbyterian Seminary for this invitation to celebrate and to interrogate the implications for this wonderful intervention of democracy and justice. And I am clad in my suffragist white to honor Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. And in light of your question, though, even in the midst of this celebration, I think it's important that we don't make the false equivalency that the question suggests. The whole issue of confusing Harris's placement or presence at the top of the ballot for the Democratic Party is totally divorced from the reality that Black women, not just in this election, but historically, have been a driving force in the well-being of communal survival and progress for Black America. So for the sake of our present conversation, if we want to define politics, that is politics with the small p, we need to look no further than the very presence and existence of the church as a foremost Black institution in the nation and actually in the world. The vitality of Black Christianity, much like that of American democracy, has always already been dependent upon the determination and dedication of Black women. Black women who have made up the most outperforming, overwhelming majority of both the Black church and the Democratic Party. Here we must realize the fact that Black female leadership in either titular or a formal way has never been given evident and universal access in terms of pastoral or political leadership. This reality belies the fact that if it wasn't for the women, to dub the signification from sociologists of religion and my dear womanist colleague, Cheryl Townsend Gilkes, if it wasn't for Black women, we wouldn't have the strength of the Black church as an institution, let alone its political driving force in the society or culture at large. Likewise, we can invoke Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's Righteous Discontent and other countless stories, including works by Anthea Butler, Marla Frederick, Melissa Harris Perry, all who document that Black women have made secular strides and sanctified worlds between Sundays as sister citizens. The idea that Black women have been the veritable backbone of sacred and secular politics should be painfully obvious. So the point that needs to be made as we're observing the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment guaranteeing Black male suffrage, or the 19th Amendment, which allowed for women to have the right to vote. Both have been at the cost of Black women's right to vote, but that ultimately meant white women over Black women. So Black women have been doubly disenfranchised over the course of American history. Because to quote Patricia Bell Scott, we live in a world where all the women are white and all the Blacks are men. Yet we benefit from Black women who have had to be brave. It wasn't until, once again, another anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act in tandem with the 1965 Voting Rights Act some 55 years ago that Black women finally had access to the ballot in this country in any fulsome fashion. But let's be clear. After this long, ignominious history of misogynoir in our electoral process, now that Black women finally have direct and undeniable access to the ballot, it's crucial to recognize that this progress did not happen because we were passive or patient. When we look back at the time, both prior to the 1960s and since then, if it had not been for Black women, the level of electoral engagement that Black communities had would neither have been feasible nor even possible, as we've seen in this most recent election. We can actually backtrack to 2016 and now in 2020. In both cases, the strongest, most undeniable vote for the Democratic Party came from Black women. The Souls to the Poll movement bears witness to this. It has been church mothers and the auntie brigade that got folks out in real strong numbers. When you see, as we championed and celebrated the fair fight work of Stacey Abrams, we can't forget LaTosha Brown, who equally fought strategically to make sure that Black votes and Black voters matter. And these women are not doing something new. They're standing within the main lane and the persistent tradition of many Black women activists like Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, who navigated and negotiated the divide between the church house and the Capitol building, the sanctuary and the streets. This is not new. There's never been any doubt from whence the real help has come. Black women have not only been instrumental, they've been integral to this process. So the issue now is, why can't we see confessions and professions that work to create policies that recognize and apologize for the blights and the blunders of the 1965 Moynihan Report, for instance, that have deemed Black women as emasculating burdens when they've been the blessing to the Black America survival as the bedrock of these yet to be United States? And additionally, why aren't we questioning and quarreling with the intracommunal craziness and illogical need to bolster the Black male ego in all of its wonders that made necessary the verifiable obstacles and various barriers to Black female leadership and Black female positionality in terms of not only the highest office within the Black community, but also within the common ground of the United States? So if we're thinking about, as we're celebrating this moment and we're believing that RGB and CT Vivian and John Lewis and others are looking down as our angels interceding, that maybe perhaps we see that the moral arc of the universe to that was popularized by Martin Luther King, but actually are the words of abolitionist Theodore Parker. Yes, it is long. But the only reason it can bend towards justice is that Black women have been bending and pulling for it. So Vice President-elect Kamala Harris is right. There has been a very real resistance to Black women's ambition that literally claims that we have been out of our lane to take ourselves seriously and run. And the fact that she didn't let that which has burdened many Black women not burden her was only because she knew very well that though she was facing the rising tide of misogynoir, she could trouble the waters because she was doing good work, the good womanish work of Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Mary McLeod Bethune, Charlotte Bass, Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan, Carol Moseley Brown, Maxine Waters, Barbara Lee, and even Michelle Obama. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris is not a contradiction. She is a continuation and the culmination of those Black women who even she tweeted and thanked just the other day. Those Black women who she unashamedly and unapologetically stated, quote, are too often overlooked and yet are asked time and time again to step up and be the backbone of our democracy. This could not have happened without Black women. Black women, as we have seen in this election, are the true patriots and the pioneers of what democracy and justice really looks like, not only in theory, not only as it was framed, but perfected in practice.
Well, I just want to say thank you for that. And I also want to add the name Stacey Abrams, who was instrumental in so many ways in this, getting this electoral turnout in Georgia. So that
absolutely, in the fair fight, she was 800,000 voters. Yes. And this is a long legacy. And the fact that you see Black women who have worked together, Stacey Abrams was not into the ego stroking of saying that because I lost my chance to be governor, I'm just going to close it up and finish on the democratic process. No, she said she went through her stages of grief. And then instead of giving up and accepting it, she decided to push back and to push forward. And that has been a long legacy, as we womanists call it, the long legacy of traditional communalism, radical subjectivity, redemptive self-love, and the critical engagement of Black women who really know that to love justice is to love the people and love them into wholeness so they can realize not only their agency, but they actually can do the work of bringing heaven down to earth and getting some demons out of office.
Well, let me just summarize my brilliant sister by saying the success of the Democratic Party has been a womanist endeavor.
Absolutely.
Amen. Amen. I'd like to ask Rachel Baard, as a person who's come to this country from another country that has dealt with issues of racial strife, that has struggled for years trying to find its way forward after the horrors of apartheid. What do you think about the way that America has handled race, particularly in this most recent election?
So First of all, I don't think the issue of race just surfaced. I think we all know that. I do think that there's been a tendency, especially among whites, to maybe after the civil rights movement, a little bit into the 70s, maybe, then they said, you know what, it's all done. We can relax now. The racial struggle is over, racism is over. And especially when Barack Obama was then, elected, we all heard this nonsense about we are now in a post-racial country. Anybody who believes that, well, I have a bridge to sell them somewhere up in Brooklyn. So it is utter nonsense. I mean, this country is so deeply racist. And I don't say that as a judgment. I'm from South Africa. I'm not in a position to judge any other country when it comes to racism. But I will tell you, when I came here 23 years ago, I came here as a student, and I had this vision in my heart. I remember back in 1991, about 3 years before the end of apartheid, I was at a church ecumenical tour, and we were visiting various churches, people in the anti-apartheid struggle. It was an amazing experience. And one of the events that happened that week was we had lunch with parishioners in their homes in Soweto, which is this large black city outside of Johannesburg. And I remember when it came time for the toast, I said, I dream of a day when our children and our children's children can sit at a table like this and it's normal. Because this was not normal in my country. We were segregated completely. And so I thought, well, I'm going to come to America now for my studies, and I'm going to see what that normal looks like. First, I walk into the dining room at Princeton Theological Seminary. I see, oh, there are all the African-American students at one table and all the white students at another table. The international students were the mixed bunch because they were just kind of, sitting together because they were lost, I guess. So, and I remember talking to friends of mine about this and said, but why is it like this? And this opened up for me the quest to learn more and recognizing that this country is as divided and very deeply so as what I grew up with. In terms of this election, I mean, it was very clear when Donald Trump came down that escalator, was it now 5 years ago, and he started talking about making America great again, that what he really meant was making America white again. Because there are a lot of white people in this country who are suffering from what I call demographic anxiety. And I am very familiar with that because South African white racism was rooted in demographic anxiety because whites there are a minority. And as whites in this country are facing the 2040 deadline, they are getting more and more anxious. And so this is what Stephen Miller's job was in the Trump White House, was to make sure that this doesn't happen. So it was very clear that this whole endeavor was deeply rooted in race and racism. And what we're seeing now with this refusal to concede, I mean, that Trump refuses to concede is no surprise because we all know he's a raging narcissist, but that the GOP is going along with that. This is birtherism 2.0, I guess, 0.2, whatever, because just like they suggested with birtherism that Barack Obama is not legitimate because he's not really American, so they are suggesting now that this ticket, which consists, first of all, of Kamala Harris, who is obviously this historic first, but also of this man he looks just like all the guys in the GOP, and he talks a lot like them, but he's only ever shared a ticket with a black person. Think about that. And so in their minds, my suspicion is they see him as a race traitor. And so he cannot be made legitimate. And she definitely cannot be made legitimate. And so it is this refusal to admit this ticket and delegitimizing it is very much rooted in racism. And I wish that whites will start talking more about this and about race in general, and talk about it not always in these terms of, oh, I feel so guilty when people accuse me. We need to stop making it about us. It isn't about me and my guilty feelings. It's about my moral responsibility. Yes, you're not guilty of something your ancestors did, but it still has something to do with you. You are still morally responsible to deal with that. And so for me, as a systematic theologian who focuses a lot on the doctrine of sin, this distinction between guilty feelings, which is not a real recognition of guilt, and taking up moral responsibility for the structures that our people have created, that is a conversation that we should be having a lot more.
Thank you so much. And you bring such a unique perspective for us here in the American South, coming from South Africa, to say, yeah, this looks a whole lot like what we saw back at home. I'm really appreciative of that. I want to bring a colleague of mine in, the brilliant scholar, author of The Politics of Jesus, Reverend Dr. Obery Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks, as you reflected on the way that Jesus intersected with the political realm, I wonder, thinking about this particular era, where does the Jesus movement find itself at this point in time? How should we, as followers of Christ, how should we be focusing our political will at this moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you. Pardon me. Thank you for the invitation, and my apologies for being tardy. I'm not as adept at, I'm good at a lot of things, but this technology is not one of them. Or I could say that I wanted to make a dramatic entrance so I wouldn't be overshadowed by the illustrious Dr. Stacy Floyd-Thomas. But at any rate, I'm here. Well, I think that it's a time when we have to go back to first principles and ask ourselves, what is it that we are about, and what do we believe? What is the core of our faith? What is the animating core of our faith? And I think we must go back to a couple points. First, the fact that mishpat, justice, is the most important ethical concept of our faith, right? Something that's not talked about much, but it is the most important ethical concept. It underlies it all. Then when we look at the gospel, Jesus said that loving your neighbor as yourself is as important as loving God. It is the same. And we love our neighbor as ourselves, means we want the same for our neighbors ourselves. That means that we couple that with mishpat, justice. We're talking about egalitarian justice. Everyone has the right to be all right. Everyone has the right by virtue of being created by the same God. Everyone has a right to the same access, not necessarily the same ends, but the same access to the good things of the tree of life, the fruit of the tree of life. And then I think the other central thing with the gospel is that Jesus tells us the primary way that we will be judged. And he does that, of course, in Matthew 25, 31 through 46. And it ends up, as you have not done it to the least of these, you have not done it unto me. If we put these together, if to me, this is the core of the gospel. Someone might come up with another core, but we must have an animating principle for movement. So I think that's the thing for us to do at this point. What does a just body politic, a just political economy, what will that look like from this point? And judge the candidates and their policies from that perspective, such that, of course, that means that we're not we don't take partisan sides, but it also means that, and I'm saying this as delicately as I can, but it also means, for instance, as thrilled as I am with the importance of the breakthrough of the glass ceiling with Kamala Harris, for instance, and the importance of her perspective being at the head of government, and also the symbolic importance of her breakthrough. As important as that is, she can't be given a pass from this point forward. We must apply those principles to anything that she and Joe Biden that they propose, and stand our ground. And of course, we do it. I mean, as a loyal. If we're in opposition, we'll do it as a loyal opposition, right? But we must take a stand based on principle. And so we talk about a Jesus movement. The Jesus movement stood on principle, and I think in that way, be analytical. We can analyze what's going on in the political realm. We can also be prescriptive. We can prescribe what should be happening. So from a faith perspective, there should be health care for all. There should be a minimum income for all. There should be a social safety net for those who need it. I think it's important for us to articulate it from a faith perspective, because that also means that we have to speak in terms of the frame that the other side understands. They think we're godless liberals, and we must the only way we can really bridge the gap is I don't know that we can bridge it much, but so much anyway, because these people know that he's evil, and a lot of what moves them is animus. But at the very least, it gives us a bridge across which to approach them. So that's where I think we should be at this point. It's a great opportunity for us to ask ourselves who we are, what we believe, and what are the implications for that in an uncompromising way to ask that question.
Amen. Thank you so much. In essence, what you're suggesting is that instead of being allied to partisan politics, there needs to be a way that we can begin to be aligned to the morality of Jesus, predicated on this notion of love of neighbor as self, and the larger notions of mishpat and tzedek, these larger notions of justice. So thank you. I appreciate the analysis there. It'd be wonderful if we'd find a way to move, quote unquote, the Jesus movement in this day and age in that direction. Yeah. I'd like to ask my brilliant student, colleague, partner, Sam Zeigler, just about, as we're in this day and age, tell me a little bit about the responsibility of a seminarian for being engaged in these larger movements for change. And we see that there's going to be a necessary movement. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement that's popped up. We see a larger movement this summer that came into being over voting and voting rights and access to the polls. And I've heard some wonderful things, but what is the seminarian's responsibility to be involved in these things? Don't you have enough to do with schoolwork and all these things?
I'm not going to touch that last question, but I will say that from my experience, my two core values, my two main convictions are justice and love as compassion. And I also believe that as seminary students, we're learning to be church leaders. We're learning to be academic leaders if we choose to go down that path. We're learning how to be justice leaders if we choose to go into the nonprofit world, chaplaincy, etc. And in that respect, for me, it kind of comes down to living out what we're being taught, living out what we believe. And I have heard some pushback from people who are already ordained that I do need to be careful a little bit about not putting myself out there too much as far as advocacy, because it may affect whether or not a church wants to hire me later. And on the one hand, I have heard those criticisms and kind of realized that, yes, there is a little bit of that. But on the other hand, I feel as though I'm not actually living into the call that brought me to seminary if I'm not taking responsibility for my role in either perpetuating injustice, be it through inactivity or through existing as a white woman in a system that is designed to benefit me. And I feel like I have a responsibility, therefore, to work for justice. And that is a part of my call. That is a part of why I am in seminary. And that is a part of why I'm even seeking to serve the church at all. So as far as the responsibility, I think that it's less a political responsibility than a moral, ethical, living into, as Dr. Hendricks said, the convictions of the Jesus movement, and that we have to, if we want to live out what Jesus is saying, we're going to have to do it. And I know from my position as a white woman that I was very relieved earlier in the week, but I also recognize that it's not over. And that, especially for me personally, I need to take responsibility for the fact that an overwhelming majority of white women voted a certain way. And that if I want to work for justice, I have to own that. And I have to own the fact that the system works in my favor and work to change that system. And if that means being involved in justice movements, so be it. That is my responsibility. And that is my call.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for that assessment. And if you represent the students of Union Presbyterian Seminary, we must be doing something right. I'm grateful. Grateful for that. I want to ask you all, and please feel free to jump in on this question as you will. I always am thrilled when we have the State of the Union address, and that always begins with the president walking out and saying, "The state of our union is strong." But as I come to this point in the aftermath of this election, I have to wonder if I could say the same thing about the state of our democracy. I think this last election has shown some incredible fissures in our democracy. I want us to reflect on that for just a moment here. And as we think about the state of our democracy, I want us to think about this ideological divide that seems to persist. It's an ideological divide. It is a partisan political divide. It is a racial divide. It's probably even an age divide. Tell me a little bit about how we begin to bridge this divide and to begin to work towards redeeming our democracy. Dr. Floyd-Thomas, I think you're muted.
I'll take a shot at that and try to bridge that with Dana Purdum's question, where she was asking about Eva Longoria's remarks concerning Latinas trumping Black women and how they came out in the election. As an emphasis, I really do believe that we have to look at politics as a small p, and that's why I'm just so excited. My brother, beloved, and colleague Obery Hendricks is on the panel tonight, because we really do need to look at where is the Spirit of the Lord among us? Where do we really see democracy happening? Where do we see people working to do the work of justice, to quote Cornel West, which is what love looks like in public, which we hear Sam kind of wrestling with, right? Because she's saying even in theory and praxis, even as one is preparing themselves for ordination, they seem as if they have to set aside their principles so they can be legitimated in the politics even of the church. And that's disappointing. And so in Dana's question, where she's using this case study of Eva Longoria talking about Latinas versus Black women, she got called out. She got called out. And when she got called out, her very good friend, Kerry Washington, right, put herself into say, this is how you're being perceived. This is what you said. And she was calling her because they had a relationship and she believed that she had a certain form of character. And it was clarified in being called out that what Longoria went on to mean was she was saying it's very clear that Black women have been the backbone of democracy. That's literally what she said. She said, but what Black women have been able to do, they have not always had to fight the majority of their men in the process. She was saying that the way in which Latinas had to significantly override Latino men, right? meant that they had a significant struggle for which they should be applauded. She also admitted that when we talk about Latinas, we're also talking about Afro-Latinas. Now, we know that Black men, for the majority, went Democratic, right? But not in the same numbers as Black women. But demographically speaking, what Evelyn Longoria was saying had some saliency. But the only reason we have that clarification, the only reason we can now bridge that divide is because there's somebody who had the ability to confront and to clarify, thereby cultivate the collaborative work of justice. See, it's not enough just to be in proximity, right? It's not about little Black girls and little white girls and little Black boys and little. It's not about our proximity. It's not about sitting together at the cafeteria table, right? It is about having our loves ordered correctly, right? The line between love and hate is thin. It's a thin line. And we love those things that affirm us. And we hate those things that challenge us. But those of us who actually have relationships, and those of us who are literally in love with democracy, we can call people out in order to call them into community. But that takes the real work, right? As a church, of really saying that the Spirit of the Lord is upon you to set free those who are captive and to liberate the oppressed, right? Literally that Luke 4:18 ethical mandate, right? And it also means doing the work of confrontation and wrestling with the similarities as we collaborate in this project of justice.
Yeah. You know, I think that, I mean, you said that so well, Stacy, and I think that, again, I would say with democracy, it probably bears repeating in the public square what democracy is, you know, and calling out, as you say, anti-democratic. Can you hear me? All right. Okay. I thought I was muted. Sorry. Okay. But it calls, and I mean, we need to call out anti-democratic pronouncements and deeds as they happen. Part of what has not happened is those in power were not calling out Trump consistently and saying, wait, man, this is anti-democratic. I mean, going way back. I mean, when President Xi, is that how you pronounce his name, from China, when he was here and Trump introduced him as president for life, and he said, maybe one day we'll have a president for life. They should have jumped on him with axe handles, because at that goes against the basic principles of democracy. And we've allowed so many undemocratic and anti-democratic things to go by in these last few years without even challenging them, that so many people now seem to be confused about what democracy is. And that is why we can have all of this fool about the election, because you know, folk don't seem to realize that challenging election results when nothing wrong has been proven is a cuts to the soul of democracy. And so many people don't realize they're in the streets demonstrating, supporting Trump, but they're really supporting the calling for a death knell of democracy. And so again, I'd say it's about standing up and stating and restating over and over what democracy is and what is anti-democratic. And if because there are no civic lessons in most schools now. Folk have no sense of how the government is supposed to run. They don't have a sense of what democracy. democracy isn't, well, I don't have to wear a mask if I don't want to. That's not democracy. By the way, just a corollary, and I'll leave it at this, but something that we have to get straight on point Christendom is that Christianity is not libertarian. And so that means that freedom is not the main principle of the biblical faith. It's responsibility, right, to the community and to one another. And that's one other thing we have to throw. But all this is all screwed up now. Freedom to not have to do what you don't want to, rather than freedom to be part of community. And these things have to be rearticulated, I believe.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm hearing you say that, in essence, this pseudo-patriotism is actually sounding the death knell to our democratic experiment.
Yeah, I said that's just simply too.
I think he's also talking about the way in which democracy, a la the United States, is more about freedom and market success, and not about this notion of paideia, not about the Enlightenment, the evolution of character, of being kin and kingdom, right? And I think we have lent, even within the education process, this type of indoctrination or schooling or training of minds to believe that it is the end, it is the bottom line, it is being black on the books, not red on the books, in a way of cash rules everything around me, dollar bill, y'all, right? This whole notion of being a first world power rather than being a moral exemplar is how people have misdefined democracy. We've lost sight of paideia, not only within the academy, but also within the church. But because when we say God bless America, as if we're damning the rest of the world to support our market economies and the globalization and evisceration of all other communities that make up the 2/3 world. That's what we've understood as the patriot. That's what we understand as the pioneering genius of America. And it has not been. And that's the division. The division is the miseducation of what democracy really is. And it really needs to be reframed.
Yeah, it's ruled by the people and not the elites, and we've lost sight of that. That's for sure.
Amen. Dr. Baard, I want to jump in on this.
Yeah, my fear is that for a lot of people, they've really actually given up on democracy. If you read, I sometimes wade into the pestilence-filled waters of right-wing, media online, and it is shocking the kind of rhetoric that you see there. I forget who is it that said that if the GOP finds it can no longer win democratically, which technically it really cannot anymore, it will not abandon its racisms and things that lead it to that point, but it will abandon democracy. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. And that is coupled then with that, as I said earlier, that racist assumption that people of color are not fully citizens. And so how dare all those black women go and put a black woman on the ticket and go and put this race traitor, as I imagine they see Biden, on this ticket. And so it cannot be legitimate because the citizenship is not recognized. And then they would actually even go and talk about, when they talk about the Electoral College, which we all know is a remnant of slavery, and it gives disproportionate power alongside gerrymandering to overwhelmingly white areas in the country, then they would almost sometimes explicitly say, well, we're not a democracy, we're a republic, which technically is true, but it's also a way of avoiding the question of democracy. Then it's like, it doesn't matter that the majority's will is not being heard because it doesn't matter for them anymore. So my fear is, and I come from a country where, democracy was a hard-fought achievement. And so it is a precious thing. And my fear for this country is that people will, not everybody, but a lot of people are abandoning it because they don't see it as working anymore for various reasons.
I think that's a very good point. They see it part of the problem is that they see democracy working for folk, also working for folk that they don't want it to work for. And they'd rather, as you said, they'd rather jettison democracy than to have democracy benefit those that they don't feel worthy of it.
Interesting. I always wrestle with one of my colleagues' statements that we in America need to recognize that being part of a democracy is a significant responsibility. Dean Richard Boyce always emphasizes the point that there should be a compulsion. I don't think there are consequences, but a compulsion to vote. This is our obligation. If we are to have the entitlements of a democracy, i.e. self-governance, then we have a responsibility to participate. Now, I just want to put this out there. And one of the things I want to start off with is, as we participate in our democracy, what is the responsibility beyond voting? I remember Barack Obama famously said at the after he was inaugurated into office, you know, you got me in, but this isn't the end of the work. This is the beginning. Now you have to keep me accountable to do the things you want to see me do. You got to come out and protest. You got to push me to do those things you want to see me do. What is our responsibility in the midst of this democracy? Sam here. Start with a young person's perspective here.
Okay. So for me, it again goes back to the ethical things that I was bringing up in my original statement, because I lean quite heavily on the theological work of French mystic Simone Weil, who was a Jewish woman who converted to Catholicism and wrote the vast majority of her works in the midst of occupied France in 1939 through 1943, which was the year of her death. And one of the things that she highlighted is that in a functioning, quote unquote, free society, it is necessary that everyone has an obligation to fill the needs of others. And one of those obligations in interacting with government is not just participating in the positive aspects of government, but if the government is unjust, then finding ways to try to correct it. What is kind of a very French cultural thing. There are constant jokes in French studies about the fact that the French will, if there's something that they don't like, they're going to go protest it. Which there's a protest in Paris pretty much every day of the week. But I think that's something that we don't, particularly white people, unless it directly affects us, we aren't as likely to go out and try to correct those things that are not quite just in our own systems. And that has been challenging, I think, for us to overcome, because it's learning empathy for others. And how do I fulfill my obligation to other people who are not like me by going out when there's injustice against them and actually taking part and actually putting my own self on the line, my reputation, as some of the protesters were doing during the George Floyd uprisings, their own bodies in defense of those who are in the most danger in those cases. And there are some more like calm, not going out in the streets ways of just making sure that we're interacting and modeling to, I almost said students, my background's in education, modeling to children, etc., and those around us, like, this is how we should behave. This is how I should honor the other. And this is how I should challenge racism, challenge sexism, etc., in the world that I see.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? What is our larger responsibility in the democracy? What are we charged to do beyond voting?
You raise a. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the introductions. Your name just spoke, Sam. Okay, got you. Sam, you raised an important point about Simone Weil. She, as you know, she went to work in the factory to be in solidarity, and she talked about how it all but destroyed her, and which raises the question of capitalism. Capitalism and democracy are not compatible in the final analysis, right? Capitalism we can go down the line, but it's not whoever has the most capital has the most votes. So it's not about one person, one vote when you have a capitalist society, and which means that we have to also interrogate capitalism. And we have to be aware of it. And it comes down to raising consciousness again, first principles. Martin Luther King, as we know, was a staunch critic of capitalism from his teens. And he was careful about it, of course, because of the Red Scare time. But now, the majority, if the polls are correct, majority of young people, at least nearly a plurality, at least of young people, are willing to consider to be in dialogue with socialism, and democratic socialism is closer to the ethical message of the Bible than capitalism is, right? So, these are kinds of things that I think we need to raise in the context of democracy, because how can we have a real democracy and have the vast chasm of income inequality that we have? That's not ruled by the people. I remember a few years ago, Walmart actually was firing employees if they discuss their employment conditions or salaries and wages in social media. They could be fired. They talked about their own income, right? So this is an egregious case, but these are the kinds of things we need to raise people's consciousness again. The ignorance in this country is amazing, and we talk about the church. It really bothers me that so few ministers seem to really pay close analytical attention to what's going on. There are many who don't even really read the newspaper with a critical eye. And so in order to really strengthen our democracy, we have to start raising consciousness. We have to start teaching. And that means, op-eds, that means preaching, that means new courses, that means, all kinds of coalitions and alliances with others who can help inform the populace. Democratic socialists, they have a lot of good literature. We just have to really start. We just have to really start reaching out and forming alliances or coalitions with folk who want to make a more just political economy. And it doesn't matter. They don't have to believe what we believe. They don't have to believe in a God at all, for instance, as long as they believe in justice and in fighting for a just political economy. And that's what is not going on in this country. And until we start raising consciousness and educating the people, it's going to continue as it is. One last point. I recall during the movement in the 60s, many of the organizations, the Black Panthers, some of the Black cultural nationalist groups, they were running educational programs in the community on Saturday, political education. And these are the kinds of things that we're going to really have to do to make a difference, I think.
Amen. Thank you. I like that group of different things that we can do. We have a question from the audience. Evelyn Hooper asked a question about just the larger movement for the sanctity, dignity of Black lives. And now we're at this wonderful time period where we've elected the Biden-Harris ticket. We are moving towards a better era, let's hope and pray. But this is a great sense of relief. But does it also come with a threat that we will pause in our work? Does not having a white supremacist in the White House make it more likely that white allies will fall away in this effort? And I will add to her question and say, how do we keep people at the table, and how do we keep people working towards the end of a more just nation?
I think we have to. The wonderful thing about this social distance time is that it's compelled us to be more engaged and more intimate. I think it's an interesting case study to do the critical reflection and pondering that would Black lives have mattered enough to American society if they weren't compelled to sit down in their own houses with the inability to go anywhere else and listen to the pain and the agony of people who look like them or do not look like them. There was no escape than to see the evidence, right? The civil rights movement that that Black women organized and King championed, right, was made feasible because they literally had to take pictures and make postcards and have snapshots of the spectacle that people could not turn a blind eye. And we know that this has been happening for years. But the fact that we could not get our takeout or go out to the restaurant and eat our family meals in quietude and peace while seeing bloody bodies battered, which we had been doing prior to the social distancing. But the fact that we had to look at ourselves and look at our family, having no other escape but that news, it kind of revives that same civil rights movement into realizing that there, but for the grace of God, right? Because the coronavirus was moving just as stealthily, right? And indiscriminately as Black lives that were being lost in the street. So but what it's afforded us, like this webinar series, it would not have existed if it wasn't for the fact, oh my gosh, how can we use PR? How can we do lifelong learning? How can we reach out virtually, right? We found ways to plant flowers in the mud and to sow seed in the crevices of cement because we needed to eat. We need to learn from the Stacey Abrams and the way that she learned from the Ella Bakers and the way that Ella Bakers learned from the Harriet Tubmans to say the only options are life and death. And so I'm going to take where I stand as my land to plant, grow, and harvest using any way that we have access. The problem within the American public square is that the tendency is to give the mic, to give the spotlight, to give the pulpit, to give the platform to that loud, controlling, heteropatriarchal voice or those who prop that voice up. But in this time of separation and distance and disease, we've all had a voice. We might not have been out in the streets protesting, but we were tweeting. We were using social media. We were using webinars. We were using blogs. So that's what we cannot stop. Voting might have created the ticket to now get placed in the office. But if we don't come up with an agenda in that first 100 days that talks about what democracy looks like, if we don't go back to our institutions and do a real curricular revision to talk about paideia, to talk about the politics of Jesus, to do an inventory of our syllabi, if we don't go back to our adjudicatories and talk about polity and politics, right? If we are not re-educating and clarifying for our children after they've spent most of their time at school being indoctrinated rather than enlightened by talking to them about what they see on television, because now when Trump is talking, it's rated R and rated X, right? And so we can't just assume that we can numb up and dumb down. We have to leave the television on and we have to do the translation and say, this is what happens when leaders don't read. This is what happens when you don't realize your history and that people died for you to have this right. And people are still dying for you to have this right, right? So I think it's those small things. And it's not about people leaving their home. As Thanksgiving is about to come upon us, we've been having Thanksgiving all year long. Why? Because we're forced at tables where we have to confront the demons that have taken up residency in our own homes, right? So people need to call out those with whom they're in community. There is no need to go engage the other. Talk about the problem where you stand, right? So I oftentimes have students who say, oh, I want to understand this perspective, and I feel like I cannot understand this perspective. And if I can understand Black ontology and Black epistemology and Black phenomenology. And I say, well, how do you understand Augustine? How do you understand Aquinas? How do you understand Baard? How do you understand Tillich? How do you understand these dead people who neither look like you or knew you? When you think about them, do you think that you need to take on their bodies? Do you think that you actually need to become the walking dead? No, you see them as having minds. But when you engage somebody who does confront you, right? When a Black woman either has to be seen as your hindrance or your help, but cannot be seen as human, that means that the justice, right, that looks like love in public necessitates that we need to adjust our loves. Because proximity is not enough. And if the confrontation and the re-education starts at home, I think that's what we have to do. And we need to take, I don't want to see Union Presbyterian Seminary stop these webinars. See, that's the thing. We have to say, what have we learned now that we're going to commit to do? Amen. Right? Amen. So I think we need to really glean from the harvest in the midst of this famine and operationalize it. Because that's what Black women organizers have been doing. Stacey Abrams did not stop. Right? She organized. What did I learn from this?
You know, can I just say real quickly? The other question we have to ask is, will the relief that we are experiencing from the evil person in the Oval Office, will that cause Black folks to relax as well? I mean, that's a real concern, and that's what concerned me about Kamala Harris. She's very much she's up to the job. There's no question about it. And but when I've seen so much celebration going on, I said, well, that's good, but it sort of concerned me, because are we not going to be critical, or are we going to rest and say, oh God, we had a Black president, and I have a Black woman as vice president, and we're so happy to get this guy out of office. Are we going to relax? And I don't
think we're going to relax, though.
Pardon me?
I don't think we're going to relax, especially those of us who have been, that's my prayer, right? What is clear is that while we might be victorious, it's very clear that the resident in office, as evil as he is, was so close amidst all of what he has done, right?
Yeah.
Trump didn't make America racist. He made racists feel comfortable enough to show their faces in public. They are so comfortable that they didn't want to wear any mask anymore.
And what's so dangerous about this guy is he's not going anywhere, right? He started a PAC. He announced today he has a PAC. And so, right, I mean, we should not relax. I'm hoping that's not the case. We saw what happened with when Obama got in, though. A lot of people fell away. I mean, I would ask, and I'll let others speak, but I would ask, well, Stacy, I don't know if it's fair to ask this, but I would ask, like, as happy, as thrilled as we are having a Black vice president, do you think that, for instance, the Deltas would criticize her as strongly as if she goes against interests as they would a white woman in that position? No, that's not fair, because it'd be a different kind of engagement.
No. I think your question is right. We are in a situation where we have the right to be wrong, but we don't have the right to remain silent.
Amen. Amen.
This time necessitates a vision of vulnerability and voice.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But because our lives have literally been on the line, regardless of our social location or our pre-existing diseases.
Mm-hmm.
As a country, our lives have been on the line. And so we have to be able to call people out.
Mm-hmm.
And the first way to call people out is to call them into accountability based on what we want. See, instead of just being passive to the ticket, we need to be proactive.
Yeah.
Those first 100 days in office, I mean, I would love to see the Association of Theological Schools, for instance, to write our own agenda of the office, because we are supposed to be the moral conscience, right? We have a separation of church and state, but the role of the church is to show the flag how to wave with character and conviction for the least of these. If all of our constituencies, the Divine Nine, if all of the Black sororities and fraternities said, here is an agenda, but because you purport to speak our language, here is an agenda. How are you going to be accountable to that? It's when we love people, we let them know our expectations.
Amen.
And when they don't meet them,
Yes.
we call them out as we call them in. And we love them into wholeness. So we cannot afford to numb up and dumb down in that way.
Amen. Let me ask a question here that takes us along with this thing, a slightly different direction now. What is the responsibility of white allies, given the numbers that we saw? More than 71 million people voted for a clear supremacist who had taken it upon himself to threaten, telling the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by, threaten the lives of Black and brown people. What is the responsibility of white people at this point in time to stand up and say something about justice, about truth, about race in this moment? Let me start with you, Dr. Baard.
Well, first of all, our responsibility is to our own communities in the sense that we have to speak truth within our own communities for the sake and on behalf of other communities. My job is not to tell other communities what to do. My job as a white ally is, first of all, to speak to my own people. And that, because we already have those established relationships, right? They're already our cousins and our siblings and our parents and our neighbors. And so, now for me as a foreigner, it gets complicated, but by way of analogy, right, it's still there. The second thing I want to say, and this is sort of connecting with what we talked about before, we need to insist on truth. There has been too much truthiness and alternative truth and fake news and all that nonsense that's been peddled because the truth, people don't want to face it. They don't want to face what is really true. And also, we just epistemologically, it is important for the church, and theologically, it's important for the church to say truth matters. We cannot make everything about subjectivity, because then we can hide behind the idea of subjective opinions, and people no longer try to find common ground. Then people just live in their own little thought bubbles. What I see going on, especially in the white community, apart from the racism that's so obviously always been there and still is there, and which I think Trump really drove to the surface. I mean, that was clear from the start, that he was giving permission to a lot of people to become more open. The upside of that is it also forced, I think, a lot of white people to choose, because they could no longer pretend that this is a problem of yesteryear. They were forced to, and still are forced to choose. I'm losing my train of thought a little bit, but that we need to address the problem of thought bubbles that we see in the white community especially. I mean, if you go and you see what the right wing, for example, is talking about, they are literally talking not about different opinions even anymore. They're living in a different world. They're living with different factoids than the rest of us. And so how on earth do we break through that epistemological barrier? This is something that the churches will have to play a role in addressing as well. That we have to insist on being serious about truth, that not everything is about just, well, you can't talk to me about this because it's my opinion kind of thing, which people use as an excuse not to engage issues that they should be engaging in. That's a short answer of a big issue. Right? I can't say everything that white allies are supposed to do, but that's one of them.
Thank you for that. Sam, did you want to get it?
Yes. So one of the things that I'm thinking about with this is the huge separation that happens on Sunday mornings racially in this country. And the fact that there's a similarity with the segregation that happens in the LGBTQ community in churches, in that a lot of churches want to say that they are open and affirming or accepting, etc., but do none of the work to remove microaggressions and traditions, applications of theology. I have to be very careful if I get into theology because Dr. Baard is my professor. Our applications of theologies in ways that are harmful. And then the responsibility then, both for that issue and for the hidden racism in our churches, is that we have to challenge ourselves to find our own prejudices and remove those microaggressions that exist in our churches, remove all of the associations that we make that are traditionally accepted but not necessarily positive, like the association of whiteness with good and blackness with bad that comes out particularly in church-oriented art. And navigating all of those things, the portrayals of Jesus as a white man, etc. And the only way that we can honestly have conversations and have conversations outside of our own communities is if we first do the work of detoxifying the communities that we already have, our congregations, the friend groups that we create, etc.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. Thank you for that response. Let me turn this next question. I want to throw it over to you, Dr. Floyd-Thomas. Garrett Combs is wrestling with a question about what do we do about evangelical televangelist Christianity and its tendency to portray a false narrative about what the Christian faith is about. I'm sure that Dr. Hendricks would want to jump in on this one as well. I'm sure Dr. Baard is going to jump in on this one as well. But let me start with you, Dr. Floyd-Thomas.
Well, so of course, when you started saying that, I just started laughing in my mind because I'm seeing Paula White praying for the intervention of African angels to save the presidency for Donald Trump, for whom she serves as spiritual advisor. Yet every single reference he has made in his office has been disparaging against the very people that she ministers to. I think it goes back to what Sam was making inference towards, which is there is some yearning to have this kind of melting pot notion of Christianity and religiosity without allowing that to exist outside of our sanctuaries on Sunday. It's always interesting to me that people are interested in the segregated hour of Sunday, or why the children are sitting in separate at the cafeteria tables, but you never ask, why is your neighborhood all white? Why is your country club all white? Why are your friend groups all white? Or when I do social strata inventories of people, and the question is, have you ever spent 24 hours in the presence of a Black person of color's home without sleeping in their bed? And then the shock, right? A whole bunch of hands about to go up. And as soon as I say that, then the shock. The issue is why evangelicals have a tendency to celebrate. And I'm going back to my good colleague, Robert P. Jones, who talks about being white too long, or womanist progenitor, Jackie Grant. The fact of the matter is, there's a difference between the white Christ and the Black Jesus, right? They're Black, and I'm a Black evangelical. So let's be clear. I mean, I am a Black evangelical, but of course, Black people are neither seen as human, neither seen as Christian. And so, of course, evangelicalism also gets afforded too. But and to a lot of people, it's like, well, how can you be? Because everything gets claimed by those who have the loudest voice and the most power. The issue is there is no reckoning of this gospel with one's practice, right? It's the ethics of the theology that people purport do not carry out. And so why evangelicalism has become civil religiosity. It has allowed Trump to trump Christ. It has allowed the flag to cover up the cross and burn it down. It has allowed the saints to become ain'ts, right? I mean, it has literally been that which has overshadowed the very theology that they confess. So it's devoid in my book. It is literally, and Robert P. Jones talks about, his work is, if we're going to talk about what it means to be a white ally, what he's doing to me represents that, right? People who are saying, I don't need to worry about what people of color are doing. I know very well, and I can start at home. He said he literally had to write the text in its fullness and send it off before he could even talk to his family about it, because he knew that if he talked to his family first, if he had engaged them in the project, that it would become predatory or perverse to the progression of the work. And then once it was published, to say, here's this offering to save us. I mean, I really do believe, and he and I had this long engagement, because he was saying, well, what do I do? What do we do with Christianity? Is Christianity bankrupt? And people were asking the Cone question, do you have to become ontologically Black? And he was just like, well, and then he's like, well, what words do you have, Stacey? I said, it sounds to me that you need to be born again. Yeah. Right? That it literally is taking off. Right? I mean, and so that's the thing. There is power in the word. There's power in the language of our theologies to actually save us. But what it's been used to do is to castigate others.
Yeah. You hit me with that. Got to be born again, born out of whiteness.
Right. Not to be cloaked in blackness. No. Don't appropriate me.
And that's the thing about Robert is I've been on the board of PRRI for about the last 10 years. I watched Robert is just so exemplary, as Stacey points out, because he's concerned about what is human. and so quite courageously he stepped outside himself, his own interest, and he called it what it is, and that's why, and I think that's what we have to do with this prosperity anti-gospel, for instance, is an anti-gospel. We have to call that right-wing evangelicals. We have to point out that right-wing evangelicalism is ideological Christianity because it refracts everything through the prism of their interests, group and personal. And I think that is the way that is an important way. I don't know if it's the only way, but that's an important way to start turning the tide. We have to deconstruct what these people are doing and what they're saying, and be willing to call them out by name. I have a book coming out next year about right-wing evangelicals, Christians against Christianity. And what I decided to do, call them by name, factually. I'm not, not maliciously, but we have to stop giving these folks a pass. Why? Because it is a matter of life and death with these charlatans. And so right-wing evangelicalism is a scourge on this country. I'm not talking about evangelicalism, writ large. I'm talking about right-wing evangelicalism, because in order to be in good standing in right-wing evangelicalism now, you have to be willing, at the very least, to tolerate insidious racism. At the very least,
that's right.
If not to embrace it yourself, you have to be willing to devalue the humanity of folk who don't speak our language and look like us. I mean, it's really anti-Christian, and when you look at it, it's a movement that is imbued with the spirit of Antichrist, the spirit of Antichrist from the Johannine letters. I'm not talking about the beast in Revelation. Anti means in opposition to. It is anti-Christian. It is imbued with this spirit of Antichrist because they operate in opposition to the gospel, and they've made wrong appear to be right and right appear to be wrong. And there's nothing more heretical and demonic than that. There is a demonic, as my grandmother would say, help me, Lord, there is a demonic dimension to right-wing evangelicalism. And I don't mean they're demons, of course, but it's demonic in that it's
spirit possession of white supremacy.
Pardon me?
It's spirit possession of heteropatriarchal white supremacy.
Amen.
It has literally been possessed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah, it's possessed, all right.
Yes.
I mean, you look at it in historical terms, this is really sick. It's just, it only in the most outward forms does it resemble Christianity, the method of the Church of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Amen. Dr. Baard?
Yeah, I mean, my students get very uncomfortable when in my systematic theology classes, I use the language of heresy because they think it's very judgmental. But sometimes we are called to use the word heresy. Mm-hmm. I think on so many levels. I mean, white evangelicalism of the Paula White variety in particular we're talking about here is, as Dr. Hendricks says, imbued. It means rooted in white supremacy. It is possessed by that demonic possession of white supremacy, as Dr. Stacy Floyd-Thomas says. And it's also really devoid of actual Christian content for the most part. It is this impoverished gospel of something to do with abortion and gays and this individual salvation of, my little ticket to heaven kind of thing. And that's it. And it is so frustrating. I mean, the other day I was following some conversation online where one guy said, oh, Donald Trump is definitely a bigger Christian than Biden. I'm like, that sentence makes no sense grammatically, theologically, ontologically, epistemologically, at any word. It makes no sense on any It's maybe body weight. I don't know.
Nomenologically, it makes a lot of sense. Though physiologically,
That's what I said. Body weight is maybe the only key to the truth there. But the sad thing is, this is again goes back to that thing: is that we need to pursue truth with all of our force and might, because. As is it scripture that says the truth shall set us free? I'm bad at quoting scripture, Bible colleagues. Systematic theologians, we don't do that so much. But and one of the problems, apart from all of these things, in the white evangelical movement is they do not listen to the Black church. The Black church has been the as you said earlier, Dr. Floyd-Thomas, not only the backbone of democracy in the country. I mean, Black women have not only been the backbone of that, but also the backbone of the Black church. And the Black church, in turn, has been the backbone of Christianity in this country. I don't need to tell you that. You already know that. But white evangelicalism needs to start listening. White churches in general need to start listening to the history of the Black church that kept the gospel alive when white Christianity became entangled in the demonic distortions of white supremacy. We need to analyze that theology. In South Africa, theologians like Alan Boesak and Dirkie Smit analyzed the theology of apartheid. That's where the Baard Confession, that's what it responds to. We need to do that as theologians. We have many other jobs to do as well, but this is one of our jobs, is to analyze what are the theological underpinnings here and to dismantle that.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Sam, do you want to get the final word in here tonight?
I don't know if it will be as profound as anything that the rest of the people on this panel have said, but I would say that the one thing that I have noticed about why the white right wing evangelicalism has been so insidious and so gripping for so many people is how easy it is. Everything is black and white, literally and figuratively. Everything is, you're either right or you're wrong, you're sinful or you're not. And it's a way of claiming salvation by declaring I believe in Jesus without ever taking the responsibility of living out the gospel and allowing the gospel to change our lives and to change how we live, or to look at the ways that we perpetuate injustice in ourselves. And it's so much harder to get out of that. That is the theology I was raised in. That is the tradition that I grew up in. And it's so much harder to say, oh, wait, the way that we talk about people isn't really just. The way that we talk about women isn't just. The way that we talk about LGBTQ plus persons isn't just. It's way easier to just say, this world is sinful and there's nothing I can do about it. And I've got I'm not going to hell, so why should I try to figure out a better faith, a better tradition, a better theology? And I think challenging the easiness of the televangelist propaganda is one of our challenges in the church.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sam Zeigler, brilliant up-and-coming theologian. Glad that you have joined us tonight on this side of the camera. It's wonderful to have you here with us. Rachel Baard, my brilliant colleague, it's wonderful to be able to share this platform, this dais with you this evening, and have you give your brilliant perspective on this larger issue on what we do in the aftermath of these elections.
Yes. My
brilliant, beautiful sister, colleague, I remember when we both started off and we were new in this, and now you are the queen of womanist studies in this nation, and it is so great to be here with you tonight and have to hear from you in this way. My best to your brilliant partner Juan as well, and my brother Obery. It's great to have you today. I want you to know we were talking about you in my D-Mid class today. We're talking about the politics of Jesus with our D-Mid students, and they were talking about it. Just thank you for the ways that you constantly contribute, and I think I've seen you at the White House. I think I've seen you in protest and everything. So you live out this.
You ain't seen me in the White House recently, though, have you?
Not recently. I'm not talking about recently. But it's It's wonderful to have your voice in this conversation.
It's
I
wonderful.
want to just end this conversation tonight. I know that we're going to hear from the voice. Mike Frontiero is going to come back and close us down, I'm sure. But I just want to end tonight with a word of prayer for our nation. Let's look to the Lord. Holy One, you are great and gracious to us. You have given us an amazing time tonight to process, to debrief, to relieve some of the stress that has been upon us as we have dealt with the aftermath of a truly traumatic experience these last elections. Lord, we ask that you would guide us through the valley of the shadow of death, Salnevet, as we come through these next few days. Lord, we ask that there would be a smooth transition of power, and that despite what others may say, that your will would be done and there would be a nonviolent transition of power that would ensue, that violence would be abated even in the midst of these moments. And Lord, if it be your will, and I believe that it is, may we find our way back to each other. May you bridge these gaps. May you heal these divides. May we see something new. We know that we've never been reconciled, so it's hard to be reconciled. But bring us together as one, even if for the first time, that we might be representative of something greater than just ourselves. You are great, you are gracious, and we, your people, are always grateful to you for all that you do. And say, use us for your purposes. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you all for spending your time with us. And please be representatives of healing as you go forward. God bless.
God bless. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney, and thank you for watching. If you registered for the forum, please share your thoughts by taking a 2-minute survey that will be emailed to you at the end of the broadcast. Please join us again for our next panel discussion on the prison industrial complex, featuring Dr. Christoph Ringer, Assistant Professor of Theological Ethics and Society at Chicago Theological Seminary, Linda Fox, Associate Minister at Trinity Baptist Church in Richmond, Virginia, volunteer chaplain at Virginia Correctional Center for Women, and Doctor of Ministry student at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Nakia Smith-Robert, founder of Reverend Daughter Ministries and a PhD student at Claremont School of Theology, and moderated by our very own Dr. Rodney Sadler. This webinar will be Tuesday, December 1st from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Watch your email for registration. We hope you'll join us then. Have a great day.